in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast. All right, everybody. So I'm joined by Dave Schell today, and we are starting a new series called Fast Physiology, or at least that's what I'm calling it for now. That's a tentative topic.
I'll take it. Yeah, I'll take it.
And something that him and I were talking about is that we see all of these topics and things that are the next training trend, and we want to dispel a little bit of the mythology behind a lot of those training trends. As Dave was saying, right before I told him we needed to start recording, is all of these are tools for your tool belt. So what we're going to do systematically is we're going to go through, the different topics, and we are going to kind of talk about the nuances behind them, why you may not just be wanting to use one modality of training, and we're going to try to keep it to 20 minutes. That's going to be the biggest challenge I can foresee. So we'll see.
So where do you want to start with this, Phil? We were right before we started recording, you'd kind of asked me what my hope was to get out of this. So you wanted to kind of start there. Okay. So for this Fast Physiology, what is your hope for the listeners to be able to take away? Yeah, I think so. If anybody's familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's something I think about all the time. And it's this thing where when you first start out at something and you're a novice, you kind of think you know everything. And then as you learn more, you realize how much you don't know, and you kind of like get down in this plateau. And then as you start to learn more, you realize the answer is complicated a lot of times. And so I think for me, I've been coaching for about 15 years now or something like that, is like, one, as I've gotten more experienced, I've realized how much I don't know. And two, I've realized that what really matters is keeping it simple. It's really like there's a few things that matter, and if you like really focus on those things, then you're going to move the needle. And I think a lot of people chase shiny objects a lot of times. And so I guess that's my long answer about why I want to do this. I think it's a way for us to kind of like bat down a lot of the myths and a lot of the buzzwords and stuff like that, and like really bring it back to basics.
Yeah. And one of the cool things about this little mini series that we're going to do, well, I'm calling it a mini series, but it might turn into a massive series, is it's going to be hosted on both Dave and my podcast. So we'll have an episode on the Critical Oxygen podcast. Then we'll have an episode on Training Babble, which is Dave's podcast. With that, we hope you enjoy episode 1 of Fast Physiology. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by Coach Dave Schell. Dave is a longtime mountain biking coach and founder of Kaizen Endurance. Today, Dave and I are going to start a new series where we try to address one topic in a succinct manner. I'm tentatively calling it Fast Physiology. It's not a podcast. It's just going to be hosted on both mine and Dave's podcast. So, Dave, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to do this. I know you and I have been talking offline a lot about a lot of these topics, and so it's fun to kind of put it to tape and let other people benefit from our discussions as well.
With the idea of keeping everything succinct, today we are going to start with a topic that Dave and I are continually maybe frustrated about, but it's the idea of Zone 2 training. This is Zone 2 is a huge buzzword. Everybody out there is like, oh, you got to do your Zone 2 training to get, maximal mitochondrial, benefits and all this other stuff. But if I asked, probably 10 endurance athletes on the street, how do you define Zone 2? We'd probably be getting different answers from all of them. So, Dave, as a coach, if you wouldn't mind giving me your definition of Zone 2, and then I can see how that aligns with, my research background Zone 2 definition as well.
Yeah, I think this will be kind of interesting to get your thoughts on this. So first off, I was mentioning this before we started recording, is I wish we'd just stopped calling it Zone 2. And so like when I write workouts, I call them endurance, and what I define as the endurance zone, and I'm going to speak in terms of a percentage of FTP, but I kind of call endurance zone from like 50% to like 85%, with the thought being in cycling, you're going to have to go a bit harder up hills. You're going to have to go a bit harder into headwinds. You're going to go easier on downhills or with the tailwind. And in my mind, and this is where it'll be interesting to get your thoughts, I feel like things really start to change around that 85%. And so yes, we're starting to recruit more fast twitch fibers and stuff like that, but I feel like things really start to get messy, if you will, like beyond 85%. And so what do you think about that?
Oh, that's a really interesting take on it, because I think the initial thing that I think about is that some people, that 85% is going to be above their second threshold and they're going to be falling apart. So, for obviously as a good coach, you wouldn't be like, all right, your first endurance ride is going to be 85% of your FTP or something. Well, I guess if it's 85% of your FTP, then never mind. I was thinking about it from VO2 max perspective. No, I like 50 to 85%. It's like those numbers, in a sense, are kind of arbitrary. I know that Andy Coggan, did a bunch of research and compared a bunch of people to, at least the lab-based values. But when I say zone 2, I am defining zone 2 as lactate turn point 1 or lactate threshold 1, NIRS break point 1, ventilatory threshold 1, or fat max. Those are kind of the four numbers or the four values, physiological values, that I would be looking for during physiological testing that would give me an idea of where an athlete's physiology is starting to transition away from mainly fat oxidation towards more carbohydrate oxidation. And I think, it's a good definition, but there's challenges within that definition. That means that you have to have access to physiology testing facilities, whether that's a metabolic cart for ventilatory variables, whether that's you have to have somebody who's competent in lactate measurements, that in and of itself is pretty challenging, or the NIRS variables. So Moxie monitor is a prime example of that. So that's how I would define it, but I recognize that there are limitations to it, right? Not everybody has like a testing facility in their backyard. So doing something where you're finding your FTP and then doing percentages of that, I think gets you closer to what you're trying to do. And that's really what we're trying to do, right? Is we're trying to elicit a certain type of physiological adaptation in order to make our athletes have better performance, right?
Yeah, and I would go a step further in that, like when I'm prescribing that, it's usually not even like percentages. Like I might put those on as like guardrails, but it's really more about perceived effort. And so I'm telling people like your all day pace, like conversational pace, not too easy, not too hard, just right. Like, and for a lot of people, if they're going out for a 5-hour ride, I might tell them it might feel too easy the first couple hours, and it might feel harder as you get to hour 3, 4, and 5, And so really just trying to get people to tune in with what, and I guess this is something I'm trying to get out of this podcast is as I've taken on people, every time something comes out, whether we're talking about zone 2 or a new type of interval or something, people want that to be the only thing they do, or like people like really get focused on it. And but the other side of that is, especially with zone 2, people become so afraid to like go above it. And so
yes,
that's where I think it's important, is like people are like, getting off their bike to walk up a hill so their heart rate doesn't go above zone 2 or whatever. And it's like, that's where I'm like, it's a big range to account for hills and stuff. But like, yeah, we should be in the middle of it most of the time, but there's going to be some variability. And it's not like one of the old wives' tales, and why people started training by heart rate like in the 80s and maybe 90s was like, if you had to do base training, because if you didn't do that base training and you did intensity, you would blow up your capillaries, right?
Oh,
and
wow.
So it's like, I think people are still like thinking that way, where it's like, and one of the videos came out with Inigo San Milan that said if you add intervals during your zone 2, then it like blocks lipolysis in the mitochondria or something like that. And so now people are like afraid to go too hard.
Yeah,
during a 5-hour ride,
and I'm sure within that podcast, well, I hope within that podcast he clarifies, right? It's not because any adaptations, any physiology is not just black or white. It's not you're going to get just this adaptation or just this adaptation. It's a continuum of adaptation. So when you accidentally go over, right, if you go over that 85% to the 86, you didn't just ruin your workout and have to just like, call it in and be like, well, that was a wasted workout. It's like, no, 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 no. If you did 99.9% of that workout in what we'll call endurance or zone 2 or whatever you want to call it, so actually, let me take a step back. I think zone 2 training is what is the intensity necessary in order to build volume over time.
Right.
So that's the point of that easy work. It's not I'm just working at zone 2. I'm not, like this magical intensity that's all of a sudden going to just make me a perfect athlete. It's an intensity that's easy enough that you're able to build volume over time. Yeah. You can't. If people who are doubting that, go out and try to do high intensity interval training every single day, and let me know how quickly you burn out, or how quickly you get injured or sick or anything like that. Actually, don't try that, because that's not the type of advice I want to give to people. But the point of zone 2 is to build that volume over time. And endurance training or endurance performance is a volume-based sport. We see time and time again that the more volume you can accumulate, the better off you're going to be. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a definition of that. And then going back to the adaptations that you're actually getting, people are so afraid to either go over or be under that zone 2 boundary, because they think, because of different talks on different podcasts and other things like that, it's like, yes, it's optimal. Optimal adaptations are going to occur if you can pinpoint that boundary on any given day. But the challenge is that's a moving target. Unless you're measuring your lactate every single day, unless you're measuring your SMO2 every single day, or your ventilatory variables every single day, it's going to be a moving target that varies, I don't know, sometimes 10, 20, 30%, based on how tired you are, how fueled you are, how hydrated you are, other things like that. So by having practical guardrails, like you said, Dave, is super important, because, say one day it's like, okay, you're supposed to do aerobic work and you feel like absolute dog crap. Go 50% the whole time. You're still getting the 80 to 90% of the way there in terms of the adaptations that you're trying to get. But you're not doing yourself any good by trying to ride up at that 85% the entire time, because that's just probably going to, take you down a road of a little bit more fatigue.
Right. And I just want to bring up another thing too, is that you were mentioning that, like, if you're doing high intensity interval training or whatever, and I do think this is a big component of it, is that, like, everybody's heard of 80-20 now at this point. And the way that I kind of look at it is it's really volume dependent. And if somebody has 3 hours a week to train, then it might be something more like 50-50. And then as you add time, the way you're going to add more time is with more endurance / zone 2. And the point of zone 2, I always tell people, one, it's how we can add volume, and two, it's a buffer for the hard work you're doing, right? It's like it allows you to recover from the hard work you did yesterday and do more hard work 2 days from now or whatever. And so one of my kind of things with the people I work with is I always keep it flexible, and I say there's almost always room for more zone 2, meaning that, like, if you've got 6 hours a week to train, great, that's what we'll schedule for. But there's going to be times where it's like, if you have extra time that day or whatever and you're feeling good, add on another hour or two at that endurance pace.
And again, that's because you're able to accumulate that time under that tension without accumulating ideally too much fatigue. Because if you try to add another hour, if you're like, oh, I just got another hour of training that I can add, and you were to add that all in high intensity training, oh man, you'd be a mess. Like,
well, and you and we've talked about this a few times now. Like, one of the biggest things, like the biggest thing I've seen in coaching that leads to performance is consistency. And so it's whatever allows you to perform the work week in and week out over and over and over again. That's what's going to lead to performance. But I see a lot of people who have, like, a really massive week. They have their superstar week. They, like, hammer themselves, but then they can't do any work the next week and they have to recover. And it's like, so when you have that intermittent work, that's less effective than just being consistent with, like, being pretty good all the time versus being amazing sometimes. That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I fall into this trap all the time where, I start getting some momentum. I'm crushing, the VO2 max workouts, my volume's coming along. And then I'm like, ooh, I need to keep pushing the high intensity stuff, and I need to keep pushing the lower the lower intensity stuff, the zone 2. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, I went too hard 3 days in a row, and now my back is awful. And every time I get on the bike, I get spasms in my back and other things like that. And then I have to take a month off in order for it to heal up, as opposed to if I would have just backed off on increasing that intensity on both sides of the coin, then I probably would have been able to train for the next month. And even though I was only making incremental gains, I would still be better than where I'm starting back now after a 1 month hiatus, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I think I think one of the misconceptions too is that there's some magic to zone 2. And if you look at most of the research and most of the studies out there, they are done at, I don't know, a 70% of VO2 max, which moderate intensity continuous training. That's where like a lot of like the adaptations and the research has really looked to see where you're getting adaptations from. And this is where, where we see in reviews of, oh, is it high intensity, sprint intensity, or moderate intensity? What's best for which adaptations? And now everyone says, oh, well, zone 2 training is going to be really, really good for capillary density development, mitochondrial density development, and those sort of things. And I agree that you'll probably preferentially improve those markers, but it's not comparable to the moderate intensity continuous training that they're doing in some of these studies, where they're doing an hour at 70% VO2 max day in and day out, for say 5 days a week or once every other day.
Yeah. And so for people that don't speak in academic speak, and I'm sitting here trying to like do the conversion. And if I recall correctly, I think 65% of VO2 max is typically like what we would call zone 2, like 65 to 70% of like FTP. So I think 70% is getting like maybe into like low zone 3 in cycling.
Yeah,
speak.
it's getting pretty close to FTP if you're 70% of your VO2 max. Okay. Because there are some so for some individuals, like elite level marathoners, their FTP will be 85 to 94% of their VO2 max.
Right.
But for the great majority of us, it's anywhere from, I don't know, 65% to 75% is where our FTP would fall in terms of our VO2 max. So you're getting pretty close. Like you said, you're getting into that zone 3 training. You're getting really close to maybe even that threshold.
Yeah.
But it's again, so I just don't want people to get the wrong idea that all this research has been done on zone 2 training, where off the top of my head, I can really only, there was a couple heat training studies where they did an hour of training at LT1, which would be an hour of training in zone 2. And they do show really, really robust responses to that training. But again, that's because they're adding heat as a stress. Mm-hmm. But I don't want people to get it misconstrued that all the research literature out there is doing the moderate intensity continuous training. That's what you'll see, or the long, slow distance, or whatever it is primarily a little bit higher than what we would generally term as zone 2 in this day and age.
Yeah. And I just want to go back to something you said earlier. You were talking about your definition of zone 2 being like LT1, right? And so, and that it can change 20 to 30% from day to day or what have you. But I think it can even change within a ride.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's really one of the points of the reason that we do these endurance rides, is we're trying to if you're training for endurance events, we're trying to extend your endurance. And so if your plan is to ride your bike 6 hours as fast as you can, then you should probably do some 6, 7, and 8 hour rides to like extend your endurance. But as you're doing that, like as those slow twitch fibers fatigue, you start to recruit more fast twitch fibers. And so theoretically your thresholds, the LT1 would be coming down, down, down as you're recruiting more of those fast twitch fibers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a term that is now kind of thrown around a little bit more of durability, is how much does your physiology decrease over the course of a fatiguing work bout, whether that's zone 2 work, a little bit into the zone 3 work, other things like that. And your ability to resist those changes is really important in terms of just your overall fitness. There was a study that I just talked about on my Instagram where they looked at decoupling of internal and external variables during a marathon. So they had heart rate and then they had speed for these marathon runners. And they found that the people who decoupled or had the best durability were the ones that ran closest to their FTP or critical speed, and they were the ones that ran the fastest times. So, it makes sense, right? If you're more fatigue resistant than other people, then you're going to be able to perform longer endurance events better.
And so, I just want to I feel like we're kind of bashing zone 2, and I don't think that's what we're doing, but it kind of sounds like we're bashing zone 2. So now I want to make a case for zone 2, and
yes.
I think that a lot of people, because there is so much emphasis on FTP or critical power or critical speed or whatever, like everybody's answer is, I want it to be higher. And so the answer is, I need to do more work at that intensity. And I think what a lot of people miss is that that's just one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is having a lot of capillaries and a lot of mitochondria and everything that's like going to take up that lactate. And so doing that endurance work, doing that zone 2 work is also going to increase your FTP or critical speed or critical power.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want it to get, I keep using misconstrued, but no, we are not, I'm not bashing zone 2. I just think that we just have to think about it a little differently, right? Zone 2 is going to be the intensity or just the training that allows us to have more volume. Having more volume is what ultimately is kind of predictive of endurance performance. You still have to do the high intensity stuff. You still have to do everything, but zone 2 work facilitates both the high intensity stuff and truly getting better at your sport. Because
and recovery too, right? It's like
and recovery.
I think of it as like we talk about it. It's very cliche, but like having a big foundation and stuff. But it's like the zone 2 work or having the big endurance base supports all the other work you do. It's going to make it so that you can recover faster from intervals. You can recover faster day to day. Like bigger the foundation, higher the peak, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, 100% agree. So, all right, let's give like a 1 minute summary / takeaway. Is for me, it's zone 2 is the range of intensities, or I'm not even going to call it zone 2 because that in and of itself has a certain definition, but endurance work is the range of intensities that is going to facilitate your body to be able to take on more volume. It's going to set the base for that high intensity work. So if you're doing a pyramid, it's setting the base so then you can sharpen it with that high intensity work. And it's going to just lay the foundation for recovery, time on your feet or time in the saddle. And it's going to help fill in all of the other gaps or all of the extra time that you have to start training, because it allows you to accumulate more volume without accumulating excess fatigue. And consistency is one, if not the most important thing for getting better at endurance sports.
Agreed. And I think the thing that I would add to that is that zone 2 is a tool in our toolbox, not the only tool in our toolbox. And to use an analogy, if Jason Cooper were to hear this, it'd kill him, but he hates food analogies. But one of an analogy I love, because I have a culinary degree, is thinking of it like soup. And so endurance work is the broth, and high intensity is the salt. And if you use too much salt, it's going to be inedible. It only takes a little bit to like really bring out the flavors. And so you don't want to hammer it you don't want to do too much one way or the other. And so I think it like everything in moderation, right?
Yeah, no, I love that. So to wrap up, you can find me as always at Critical02 on Instagram. If you have any questions or any topics you want Dave or I to discuss for the Fast Physiology, let us know over there. You can find Dave at Kaizen Endurance. Am I saying that correctly?
Kaizen, yep.
Kaizen Endurance on Instagram, and I will tag all of his coaching website, his Instagram, his podcast, all in the show notes. And we hope you guys enjoyed this brief, trying to be succinct discussion, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
Take care.